On the morning of October 15, 1943, at 6:27 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel William Shomo crouched in his P-39 Airacobra cockpit 300 feet above the dark waters of Rabaul Harbor, watching a convoy of Japanese supply barges through his gun sight, barges that had been moving critical supplies to enemy forces for months without a single American pilot able to stop them. At 31 years old, he was commanding officer of the 7th Fighter Squadron with 0 confirmed barge kills, flying an aircraft that every pilot in the Pacific called useless. The Bell P-39. Airacobra was the plane nobody wanted. Too slow for dogfighting, couldn't climb past 20,000 feet without wheezing like an old truck, and handled like a brick with wings. When Shomo's squadron first received their Airacobras at Henderson Field 6 months earlier, his own pilots had groaned audibly. Major General Ferrucci dismissed it as a ground-pounder's toy, telling Shomo to keep his flying coffins away from real combat missions. The other squadron leaders joked that the P-39's biggest threat was to its own pilot. Even the mechanics called it the flying disaster, with its engine mounted behind the cockpit and a 37mm cannon jutting out the nose like some kind of science experiment gone wrong. The cannon itself weighed 400 pounds and fired shells designed for destroying tanks, not aircraft. Shells so heavy they slowed the plane down even more. Every fighter pilot knew the rules of Pacific air combat: speed kills, altitude wins, and maneuverability keeps you alive. The Airacobra had none of these, but as Shomo lined up his approach on the lead barge, watching enemy soldiers scrambling across its deck loaded with ammunition and medical supplies, he was about to discover that sometimes the most hated weapon becomes the most feared one. The Japanese had no idea what that nose cannon could actually do to a wooden supply vessel at close range. The Bell P-39 Airacobra arrived at Henderson Field in March 1943 like an unwanted stepchild at a family reunion. Lieutenant Colonel William Shomo watched his pilot circle the aircraft with the enthusiasm of morticians examining a particularly difficult corpse. The plane sat on the coral runway with its tricycle landing gear, itself an oddity that made seasoned pilots uncomfortable, and that massive 37mm cannon barrel protruding from the spinner like a metallic accusation. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, the squadron's chief mechanic, ran his hand along the fuselage and shook his head. "Sir, this thing's got its engine behind the pilot and a cannon where the engine should be. It's like somebody built it backwards." The specifications made for grim reading. The Allison V1710 engine produced 1,150 horsepower, respectable enough on paper, but mounted behind the cockpit it created a center of gravity nightmare that made the aircraft handle like a weighted seesaw. Maximum speed was 377 miles per hour at sea level, dropping to a pathetic 290 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, where most Pacific air combat occurred. The service ceiling was officially listed as 20,000 feet, but pilots quickly discovered that climbing past 15,000 turned the Airacobra into what Captain John Wrigley called a flying anvil with delusions of grandeur. The aircraft's range of 500 miles was adequate for local operations, but in the vast Pacific, where missions could stretch over hundreds of miles of open ocean, pilots felt like they were flying with a fuel gauge that moved faster than the airspeed indicator. Major General Enzo Ferrucci made his opinion clear during his first inspection of the squadron. He walked around Shomo's aircraft with his hands clasped behind his back, stopping to examine the cannon with obvious distaste. "Colonel, this is what happens when designers try to reinvent the wheel. We need fighters that can climb fast and fight at altitude, not flying artillery pieces." Ferrucci kicked the nose gear strut with his boot. "The Japanese Zero can outclimb this thing by 3,000 feet per minute and outrun it above 15,000 feet. What exactly are we supposed to do with it?" Shomo had been asking himself the same question for weeks. The 7th Fighter Squadron had transitioned from P-40 Warhawks, which were no match for Japanese fighters but at least felt like proper combat aircraft. The Airacobra felt like flying a compromise nobody had asked for. The 37mm M4 cannon was designed for anti-tank warfare on European battlefields, firing high-explosive shells at 2,800 feet per second. Each shell weighed 1.5 pounds, more than most machine gun bullets weighed per dozen, and the cannon carried only 30 rounds. In aerial combat, where pilots burned through ammunition in seconds-long bursts, 30 rounds felt like bringing a single-shot rifle to a machine gun fight. Lieutenant Edward Koss summed up the squadron's frustration during a pilots' meeting in early April. "Sir, we trained on this thing for 6 weeks at Hamilton Field, and I still don't understand what it's supposed to do. The cannon's great if you want to punch holes in buildings, but try hitting a maneuvering zero with it, and you'll fire all 30 rounds and hit nothing but air. The machine guns are standard 50 caliber, nothing special there. And good luck getting into position for a shot when every Japanese fighter can outclimb and outrun you." The Airacobra's unusual design created problems that went beyond mere performance numbers. The engine placement put the propeller shaft underneath the pilot's seat, connected to the front-mounted propeller by a 10-foot drive shaft that ran between the pilot's legs. This arrangement allowed space for the cannon, but it also meant that battle damage to the drive shaft would leave the pilot with a windmilling propeller and no power. The tricycle landing gear was more stable than conventional tail draggers during ground operations, but it was also heavier and more complex, adding weight the aircraft couldn't afford to carry. Training missions revealed the aircraft's limitations in brutal detail. During mock dogfights with Marine F-4U Corsairs stationed at Henderson, the Airacobras were consistently outfought at every altitude above 10,000 feet. The Corsairs could climb away from any engagement, leaving the P-39 pilots to practice evasive maneuvers and pray their opponents made mistakes. Captain Wrigley logged the results in his flight report. Attempted intercept of simulated bomber formation at 18,000 feet. By the time my aircraft reached intercept altitude, the bombers had completed their run and were returning to base. Maximum rate of climb above 15,000 feet insufficient for effective combat operations. The psychological impact on squadron morale was immediate and devastating. Pilots who had spent months training for high-altitude interception missions found themselves assigned to an aircraft that couldn't reach the altitudes where combat occurred. The Japanese maintained air superiority, partly through their ability to dictate engagement conditions, climbing to altitudes where American fighters struggled to follow. With the Airacobra, American pilots felt like they were being asked to fight with one hand tied behind their backs. Shomo watched his pilots' confidence erode with each training mission. These were experienced combat aviators who had flown successful missions in P-40s and P-38s, men who understood aerial tactics and had survived months of Pacific combat. But the Airacobra made them feel like student pilots again, struggling with an aircraft that seemed to fight them at every turn. The plane's quirks multiplied during combat conditions. The cannon's recoil would slow the aircraft and throw off its flight path. The heavy ammunition load affected the center of gravity as rounds were fired, and the unusual engine placement created unfamiliar vibrations and sounds that made it difficult to diagnose mechanical problems in flight. By late April, squadron readiness reports painted a stark picture. Of 24 assigned aircraft, only 18 were mission-capable on any given day due to maintenance issues with the complex drivetrain system. Pilot proficiency ratings had dropped compared to their previous aircraft, and mission success rates during training exercises were the lowest in the fighter group. The Airacobra wasn't just underperforming, it was actively degrading the squadron's combat effectiveness at a time when every aircraft and every mission counted toward maintaining American air superiority in the Pacific. The war was being fought in 3 dimensions, and the Su P-39 Airacobra seemed incapable of reaching 2 of them. The revelation came not from headquarters or training manuals, but from a desperate mission that nobody wanted. On the morning of May 12, 1943, intelligence reported a convoy of Japanese supply barges moving down the slot between Guadalcanal and New Georgia under cover of darkness. These weren't warships or fast transports. They were wooden vessels, 60 to 80 feet long, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements to isolated Japanese garrisons. The barges hugged the coastlines, moving only at night, and had proven nearly impossible for conventional bombers to hit with any accuracy. Lieutenant General George Kenney's headquarters had been wrestling with the barge problem for months. High-altitude bombing runs missed more often than they hit, wasting precious ordnance on empty water while the barges continued their nightly supply runs. Dive bombers like the SBD Dauntless could hit individual barges, but they were vulnerable to Japanese fighters and couldn't loiter over target areas long enough to hunt down entire convoys. B-25 Mitchell bombers flying skip bombing missions had some success, but they required multiple aircraft to destroy targets that smaller, more agile fighters should theoretically handle with ease. Shomo found himself in Kenny's office at Port Moresby 3 days after the latest intelligence briefing, standing before a wall map covered in red pins marking successful Japanese barge runs. Kenny pointed to the concentration of pins around Rabaul and the Northern Solomons. "Colonel, we're losing this logistics war one barge at a time. Every night, 20 to 30 of these vessels move supplies that keep Japanese forces operational. Our bombers can't hit them consistently, and our fighters can't carry enough ordnance to matter." He turned from the map and fixed Shomo with a direct stare. "I want you to take your Airacobras down to wavetop level and see what that cannon can do against wooden hulls." The mission parameters were unlike anything in the fighter pilot's handbook. Instead of climbing to intercept altitude, the Airacobras would fly at less than 500 feet, following the coastline until they located barge convoys. Instead of engaging in high-speed combat maneuvering, they would make slow, deliberate firing passes, using the 37mm cannon like a precision sniper rifle against individual vessels. The aircraft's greatest weaknesses, its poor high-altitude performance and sluggish climb rate, became irrelevant in this new role. Its greatest liability, the massive nose cannon, suddenly looked like a potential asset. Shomo spent 2 days studying barge construction and vulnerability analysis prepared by Navy intelligence. Japanese supply barges were built from tropical hardwoods with steel reinforcement plates around critical areas like the engine compartment and steering station. They typically carried between 15 and 30 personnel along with their cargo, and most mounted at least one heavy machine gun for defensive fire. The vessels were surprisingly resilient. 50 caliber machine gun fire could damage them, but rarely achieved quick kills, allowing crews time to beach damaged barges and salvage their cargo. The 37mm M4 cannon fired armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds designed to penetrate tank armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Against wooden vessels, the ammunition would be massively overpowered, but that might work in the squadron's favor. A single high-explosive shell could potentially blow a hole through a barge's hull large enough to sink it within minutes, while armor-piercing rounds could punch through reinforced areas that stopped machine gun fire. Lieutenant Koss volunteered for the first experimental mission, along with Captain Wrigley and 2 other pilots. They took off from Henderson Field at 1600 hours on May 16th, flying northwest toward the Japanese-held coastline of New Georgia. The flight plan called for them to descend to wavetop level 20 miles from the target area, then follow the coastline southward while maintaining radio silence. If they encountered barges, they would attack individually, making single firing passes before withdrawing to assess damage. The tactical challenges of low-level flight became apparent immediately. At 500 feet altitude and 300 miles per hour, the Airacobras covered ground quickly, but navigating by visual reference points required constant attention. Islands, reefs, and coastlines that looked distinct on maps became confusing blurs of green jungle and white surf. Radio navigation aids were limited, and the aircraft's compass became unreliable near the magnetic anomalies common around volcanic islands. Koss spotted the first barge at 1745 hours, a single vessel moving slowly along the New Georgia coast about 2 miles offshore. The wooden hull was painted dark green with irregular brown patches, making it nearly invisible against the jungle backdrop until sunlight reflected off its wake. Koss radioed his wingman and began a wide turn to set up his attack run, dropping to less than 200 feet above the water. The barge crew spotted the approaching Airacobra and immediately opened fire with what appeared to be a 25mm automatic cannon mounted amidships. Tracers arced toward Koss's aircraft, forcing him to jink left and right as he closed to firing range. At 800 yards, he lined up the barge in his gun sight and pressed the cannon trigger. The first 37mm shell struck the water 50 yards short, sending up a geyser of white foam. The second shell hit the barge just forward of the steering station, and the entire vessel seemed to come apart in a cloud of smoke and flying debris. The high-explosive shell had detonated inside the cargo hold, which apparently contained ammunition or fuel. Secondary explosions rippled through the barge's hull, and within 30 seconds the vessel was settling by the stern with its bow pointing skyward. Survivors were already abandoning ship, jumping into the water as the barge slipped beneath the surface. Koss circled the area once, confirming the kill, then rejoined his formation for the flight back to Henderson Field. The mission debriefing that evening marked a turning point in the squadron's understanding of their aircraft. One 37mm shell had accomplished what typically required multiple bombing runs or extended strafing attacks. The cannon's massive shells were perfectly suited for destroying lightly armored vessels, and the Airacobra's stable gun platform made it easier to achieve precision hits than faster, more maneuverable fighters. Most importantly, the low-altitude flight profile played to the aircraft's strengths while avoiding its high-altitude weaknesses entirely. Kenny approved expanded barge hunting operations within 48 hours, assigning specific coastal patrol sectors to Shomo's squadron. The missions would be flown at dawn and dusk when Japanese barges were most likely to be moving, and aircraft would operate in pairs to provide mutual support against defensive fire. For the first time since receiving their Airacobras, the 7th Fighter Squadron had found a mission that matched their aircraft's capabilities perfectly. The mission that would silence the doubters launched at 0530 hours on October 15, 1943. Intelligence had identified the largest Japanese barge convoy of the month, 12 vessels loaded with ammunition and medical supplies bound for isolated garrisons on Bougainville. The convoy was moving in broad daylight, protected by 4 Zero fighters, and confident that American aircraft couldn't threaten them during their exposed transit across Empress Augusta Bay. Shomo led 8 Airacobras toward the intercept point, flying at wave-top level to avoid Japanese radar installations on surrounding islands. Major General Ferrucci had made his position clear during the mission briefing 3 hours earlier. Standing before the assembled pilots at Henderson Field, he pointed to aerial reconnaissance photographs showing the convoy's defensive formation. "This is exactly the kind of operation that proves my point about the P-39's limitations. 12 heavily defended targets with fighter escort. You'll be lucky to damage 2 or 3 barges before the Zeros arrive. I'm authorizing this mission against my better judgment." His words hung in the pre-dawn air like a challenge, and every pilot in the squadron felt the weight of proving their aircraft's worth. The convoy appeared on the horizon at 0715, exactly where intelligence had predicted. 12 wooden vessels arranged in 3 columns, each barge approximately 70 feet long and mounting at least 1 heavy machine gun. The lead vessels bristled with additional armament, what appeared to be 20mm automatic cannons and multiple machine gun positions. Above them, 4 Japanese Zeros maintained a loose combat air patrol at 8,000 feet, confident that any attacking American fighters would have to climb through their defensive envelope. Shomo's tactical plan exploited the one advantage his aircraft possessed, the ability to attack from sea level while the defending fighters maintained altitude. The Airacobras would approach the convoy from the south, hidden against the dark water until the last possible moment. Each pilot would target a specific barge, make 1 firing pass with the 37mm cannon, then immediately descend back to wave-top level to avoid the diving Zeros. Speed and surprise would have to substitute for altitude and maneuverability. At 5 miles from the convoy, Shomo radioed his attack order. 8 Airacobras spread into line abreast formation, each aircraft aimed at a different target vessel. The Japanese barges continued their steady course, apparently unaware of the approaching threat, until Lieutenant Koss opened fire at 1,200 yards. His first 37mm shell struck the lead barge just aft of the bow gun position, and the vessel erupted in a spectacular explosion that sent debris spinning hundreds of feet into the air. The convoy's defensive fire began immediately. Every barge capable of bringing guns to bear opened up with machine guns and automatic cannons, filling the air with tracer rounds and explosive shells. Captain Wrigley jinked his aircraft left as 20mm rounds bracketed his flight path, then steadied for his own firing run. At 800 yards, he triggered his cannon and watched 2 high-explosive shells tear through his target's hull just below the waterline. The barge began listing immediately, its crew abandoning stations as water flooded the cargo hold. Above the battle, the 4 Japanese Zeros rolled into steep dives toward the attacking American fighters. But the Airacobras had already completed their firing passes and were racing away at sea level, their cannon shells having found targets with devastating effect. 6 Japanese barges were already sinking or dead in the water, victims of precision strikes that conventional fighters couldn't have achieved. The massive 37mm shells, originally designed to destroy German tanks, proved equally lethal against wooden vessels loaded with ammunition and fuel. The Zero pilots found themselves in an impossible tactical situation. Their targets were flying at altitudes where the Japanese fighters couldn't maintain sustained combat speed, and every attempt to engage the Airacobras forced the Zeros to dive through their own ship's defensive fire. Lieutenant Yamamoto, leading the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, attempted to intercept Shomo's aircraft as it climbed away from the convoy, but the American pilot simply nosed down toward the water and accelerated away. The Zero could outclimb and outrun the Airacobra at altitude, but at sea level the performance gap narrowed considerably. Shomo circled back for a second attack run, this time targeting one of the convoy's escort vessels, a larger barge mounting twin 20mm cannons and carrying what appeared to be a company of infantry. The defensive fire was intense, with tracers creating a visible web around his aircraft, but the Airacobra's stable gun platform allowed him to line up his shot despite the turbulence. At 600 yards, he fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. The first shell missed, sending up a waterspout just ahead of the target. The second struck the barge's engine compartment, stopping the vessel dead in the water. The third hit the main cargo hold and detonated among stacked ammunition boxes. The explosion was visible from 20 miles away. The barge simply disintegrated in a pillar of flame and black smoke, taking its entire cargo and crew with it. Secondary explosions continued for several minutes as ammunition cooked off, sending streams of tracers in all directions like a deadly fireworks display. The psychological effect on the surviving barges was immediate. 2 vessels broke formation and headed for the nearest coastline, abandoning the convoy rather than face another attack run. By 0800 hours, the battle was effectively over. Of the 12 Japanese barges that had begun the transit, 9 were sinking or had already slipped beneath the surface. The remaining 3 vessels were attempting to reach the shelter of a small island 5 miles to the north, but their reduced speed made them easy targets for follow-up attacks. The 4 Zero fighters had managed to damage 1 Airacobra. Lieutenant Peterson's aircraft had taken cannon hits in the wing route that affected his aileron control, but all 8 American fighters were returning to base. The mission's success metrics were undeniable. 8 P-39 Airacobras had destroyed or disabled 75% of a major enemy supply convoy in less than 30 minutes. The aircraft that had been dismissed as too slow for fighter combat had proven devastatingly effective in its new role as a precision ground attack platform. More importantly, the mission had been accomplished without losing a single American aircraft, despite facing determined fighter opposition and concentrated defensive fire. Ferrucci was waiting at Henderson Field when the squadron landed, standing beside the operations truck with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. As Shomo climbed down from his cockpit, the general walked over and examined the empty 37mm shell casings scattered around the aircraft. Each Airacobra had expended between 15 and 20 rounds, more than half their ammunition load, but the hit rate had been extraordinary. Nearly every shell that found its target had achieved a mission kill, sinking or disabling vessels that would have required multiple bombing runs to destroy with conventional ordnance. The intelligence assessment arrived 6 hours later, confirming what the pilots had observed during their attack runs. The destroyed convoy had been carrying enough ammunition to supply Japanese forces on Bougainville for 3 weeks, along with medical supplies desperately needed by isolated garrisons throughout the northern Solomons. The loss represented a significant disruption to Japanese logistics operations, forcing enemy commanders to rely on submarine resupply missions that were far more dangerous and less reliable than surface transport. The Japanese response to the October 15th massacre came with characteristic speed and ingenuity. Within 72 hours, reconnaissance flights reported that enemy barge operations had shifted from daylight transits to completely nocturnal schedules, with vessels now moving only during the darkest hours before dawn. More ominously, Japanese engineers had begun camouflaging major supply vessels with elaborate overhead netting and false vegetation, making them nearly invisible from the air when beached along jungle coastlines during daylight hours. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Nakamura, Staff Intelligence Officer for the Imperial Japanese Navy's 11th Air Fleet, had studied the wreckage of the destroyed convoy with growing alarm. The precision of the American attacks and the devastating effectiveness of the large caliber cannon fire represented a fundamental shift in tactical capability. His report to Admiral Kusaka was brutally direct. The enemy has developed an effective counter to our barge operations. Unless we adapt immediately, we will lose our ability to resupply forward positions. The adaptation came in multiple forms. Japanese barge crews began mounting additional anti-aircraft weapons, transforming supply vessels into floating gun platforms, bristling with 20mm cannons and heavy machine guns. Engineering units constructed false channels and hidden anchorages along coastlines, allowing barges to disappear completely during vulnerable daylight hours. Most significantly, Japanese fighter squadrons received new orders to maintain low-altitude combat air patrols, specifically designed to intercept American ground attack missions. Shomo first encountered the new Japanese tactics during a dawn patrol on November 2nd. His four-ship formation was hunting barges along the New Georgia coast when Lieutenant Koss spotted what appeared to be a single vessel anchored in a small cove. As the Airacobras descended for their attack run, the jungle around the cove erupted with anti-aircraft fire from concealed positions. The single barge was bait. 6 additional vessels were hidden beneath camouflage netting stretched between trees, and the entire cove had been converted into an anti-aircraft trap. 20mm. Shells bracketed Koss's aircraft as he pulled up from his firing run, several rounds punching through his port wing and severing hydraulic lines. Captain Wrigley's Airacobra took hits in the engine cooling system, forcing him to nurse the overheating aircraft back toward Henderson Field while trailing white vapor. The mission that should have been a routine barge hunt had become a fighting withdrawal through intense ground fire, with the Americans achieving only 1 confirmed kill against 7 targets. The tactical evolution accelerated through November and December. Japanese supply operations began using decoy barges filled with flammable materials that would explode dramatically when hit, creating the impression of successful ammunition strikes while protecting real supply vessels hidden nearby. Enemy fighters started flying coordinated low-altitude patrols, forcing American attack aircraft to engage in turning fights at altitudes where the Airacobra's performance advantages disappeared. On December 8th, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, Shomo led his largest barge hunting mission of the war. Intelligence reported a major supply operation moving toward Rabaul, with 15 barges carrying artillery shells and medical supplies for Japanese forces preparing to defend against the anticipated American invasion. The convoy was protected by 80 fighters and had chosen a route through the slot that would keep them within range of land-based anti-aircraft batteries throughout their transit. The mission plan called for coordinated attacks by 12 Airacobras operating in 3 flights of 4 aircraft each. Shomo would lead the first wave against the convoy's lead elements, while Lieutenant Koss commanded the second wave targeting the center vessels. Captain Wrigley's flight would attack the trailing barges, then all 3 formations would rendezvous at low altitude for the flight home. The plan required precise timing and perfect navigation. Any delays would expose the slower Airacobras to concentrated fighter attacks. The convoy appeared at 0645 hours, exactly on schedule, but displaying tactical innovations that made Shomo's blood run cold. The 15 barges were arranged in a tight defensive formation, with overlapping fields of anti-aircraft fire, each vessel bristling with more guns than intelligence had predicted. Above them, the 80 fighters were flying a weaving pattern at 3,000 feet, low enough to intercept diving attackers, but high enough to maintain their speed advantage. Shomo's first firing pass destroyed 2 barges with 4 37mm shells, but the concentrated defensive fire was unlike anything his squadron had previously encountered. Tracers filled the air in solid streams, and explosive shells detonated close enough to his aircraft to rattle his teeth. Lieutenant Peterson's Airacobra took a direct hit in the engine compartment, forcing him to ditch in the ocean 3 miles from the convoy. The pilot survived the water landing, but was captured by Japanese patrol boats within an hour. The second wave's attack achieved 3 more kills, but at a terrible cost. Koss's aircraft was hit by multiple 20mm shells that destroyed his cannon and damaged his flight controls. He managed to nurse the crippled Airacobra back toward friendly territory, but was forced to crash land on a small, uninhabited island 40 miles southeast of the battle area. Marine rescue teams didn't reach him until the following day, An infection from his injuries kept him hospitalized for 6 weeks. Captain Wrigley's flight encountered the most sophisticated Japanese countertactics yet deployed. As his 4 Airacobras approached their assigned targets, 6 additional barges emerged from concealment along the coastline, vessels that had been waiting in ambush with their engines shut down and gun crews at battle stations. The Americans found themselves caught in a crossfire between the convoy's defensive guns and the ambush vessel's weapons. Wrigley's wingman, Lieutenant Barnes, was shot down and killed when his aircraft took a direct hit from a 40mm shell that detonated in his cockpit. The mission's final tally showed 7 Japanese barges destroyed or severely damaged, but the cost had been devastating. 3 American aircraft lost, 2 pilots killed, and 1 captured, casualty rates that were unsustainable for extended operations. More troubling was the clear evidence that Japanese forces had developed effective countermeasures to the Airacobra's barge hunting tactics. The easy victories of October and early November were clearly over. Shomo's after-action report painted a sobering picture of evolving enemy capabilities. Japanese anti-aircraft fire had become more accurate and concentrated. Barge crews were better trained and more aggressive, and the coordinated use of ambush tactics suggested sophisticated planning at the operational level. Most significantly, enemy fighter pilots were learning to exploit the Airacobra's weaknesses during low-altitude combat, forcing American pilots to fight on terms that negated their aircraft's advantages. The strategic implications were clear to Lieutenant General Kenny, who studied the mission reports with growing concern. The P-39 squadrons had been devastatingly effective against Japanese logistics operations for nearly 4 months, destroying or damaging over 300 enemy vessels and disrupting supply lines throughout the northern Solomons. But the Japanese had adapted with characteristic speed and effectiveness, transforming what had been a one-sided tactical advantage into an increasingly costly battle of attrition. The war was entering a new phase, and the Airacobra's moment of tactical dominance was being challenged by an enemy that refused to accept defeat without adapting, learning, and fighting back with every weapon and innovation at their disposal. The question facing American commanders was whether the aircraft that had seemed so perfectly suited for barge hunting operations could continue to justify its losses against increasingly sophisticated Japanese defenses. The vindication came not from a single decisive battle, but from the cumulative weight of numbers that revealed themselves only in the final accounting of the Pacific War. By March 1944, as American forces prepared for their assault on the Marshall Islands, intelligence analysts began compiling comprehensive assessments of the barge war's strategic impact. The statistics painted a picture that even the Airacobra's harshest critics couldn't dismiss. P-39 squadrons had destroyed or damaged over 800 Japanese supply vessels in 6 months of operations, effectively severing the logistics lifeline that sustained enemy forces throughout the northern Solomons and Bismarck archipelago. Lieutenant Colonel Shomo stood in Lieutenant General Kenny's office at Port Moresby on March 22nd, studying a wall chart that tracked Japanese supply operations from October through February. Red pins marked successful barge runs, while black pins indicated vessels destroyed by American attacks. The pattern was unmistakable. Red pins dominated the chart through September, but black pins overwhelmed them from October forward. Kenny pointed to a cluster of markings around Rabaul. "Your squadrons didn't just sink ships, Colonel. You starved an entire theater of operations." The human cost of this success had been substantial, but sustainable. The 7th Fighter Squadron had lost 11 aircraft and 7 pilots during the 5-month barge campaign, casualty rates that were painful, but far lower than conventional fighter operations against Japanese air defenses. More importantly, the pilots who survived had become experts in a form of warfare that would prove invaluable as American forces pushed deeper into Japanese-held territory. Captain Wrigley, recovered from his injuries and back on flight status, had developed innovations in low-level attack tactics that were being adopted by P-39 squadrons throughout the Pacific. Major General Ferrucci's reassessment of the Airacobra program came in a classified memorandum dated April 5, 1944. His previous skepticism had been replaced by grudging acknowledgement of tactical realities. The P-39 has proven effective in roles that conventional fighter doctrine did not anticipate. While it remains unsuitable for high-altitude air superiority missions, its specialized capabilities have contributed significantly to our logistics warfare objectives. The memorandum recommended continued deployment of Airacobra squadrons in ground attack roles, with modifications to improve their survivability against increasingly sophisticated Japanese defenses. The Japanese perspective on the barge war's outcome was documented in captured documents recovered during the liberation of Rabaul in early 1945. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura's final intelligence assessment, written in February 1944, revealed the strategic impact from the enemy's viewpoint. American fighters equipped with large-caliber cannon have effectively terminated our ability to conduct surface resupply operations in daylight hours. Night operations remain possible, but are insufficient to maintain forward positions at required strength levels. The report recommended abandoning advanced positions that couldn't be supplied by submarine, effectively conceding defeat in the logistics war. The broader strategic implications became clear during post-war analysis conducted by the Army Air Force's Historical Division. Japanese forces on Bougainville, cut off from regular resupply by the destruction of their barge network, had been forced to reduce ammunition expenditure by 70% during the final months of the campaign. Medical supplies became so scarce that Japanese field hospitals were performing surgery without anesthetics, and malnutrition weakened combat effectiveness throughout the garrison. The Airacobra's 37mm cannon had achieved what conventional bombing campaigns couldn't: the systematic destruction of an enemy's ability to sustain military operations. Lieutenant Koss, promoted to captain, and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his innovations in barge hunting tactics, reflected on the campaign's lessons during a 1948 interview with Air Force historians. We learned that the most effective weapon isn't always the fastest or the highest flying. Sometimes it's the one that can hit what it's aimed at and destroy it with a single shot. The P-39 wasn't built for what we used it for, but it turned out to be perfect for the job anyway. The aircraft's technical reputation underwent a similar transformation. Engineering analyses conducted at Wright Field in 1945 revealed that the Airacobra's design problems, the rear-mounted engine, the heavy nose cannon, the poor high-altitude performance, were actually advantages in the low-level attack role. The cannon's recoil, which destabilized the aircraft during air-to-air combat, helped slow the plane during firing runs against surface targets. The rear engine placement, which created handling problems at altitude, provided better weight distribution for precision flying at low level, where atmospheric density was higher. Production statistics told their own story of evolving tactical understanding. Bell Aircraft delivered 9,584 P-39 Airacobras during the war, making it one of the most numerous American fighter types. Initially, these aircraft were distributed to squadrons expecting to use them in conventional fighter roles, resulting in widespread dissatisfaction and poor combat records. But as operational experience revealed the aircraft's specialized capabilities, deployment patterns shifted dramatically. By 1944, new Airacobra deliveries were being assigned specifically to units conducting ground attack missions, where their unique characteristics could be fully exploited. The Soviet Union's experience with the Airacobra provided an interesting counterpoint to the American story. Under the Lend-Lease program, the United States delivered 4,746 P-39 aircraft to Soviet forces, where they were used primarily for ground support and low-altitude air defense. Soviet pilots, unencumbered by preconceptions about high-altitude fighter combat, embraced the aircraft's strengths and achieved remarkable success rates. Several Soviet aces, including Captain Alexander Pokrishkin, scored multiple victories flying Airacobras in roles that American doctrine had initially rejected. Shomo's final assessment of his aircraft came during a reunion of Pacific Theater veterans in 1952. Asked about the Airacobra's place in aviation history, he reflected on the gap between design intentions and operational reality. The engineers who built that airplane never imagined it would spend most of its war flying 50 feet above the ocean, shooting up wooden boats with a cannon designed for tanks. But that's what made it successful. We found what it could do instead of complaining about what it couldn't do. The P-39's legacy extended beyond its wartime service record. Post-war tactical development incorporated lessons learned from the barge hunting campaigns, leading to specialized attack aircraft designs that prioritized low-level precision over high-altitude performance. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, designed in the 1970s for close air support missions, bore conceptual similarities to the Airacobra's approach, a powerful cannon mounted in a stable gun platform optimized for ground attack rather than air-to-air combat. By war's end, the aircraft that had been dismissed as a failure had compiled a record that spoke for itself. Beyond the 800 confirmed barge kills, Airacobra squadrons had destroyed hundreds of trucks, trains, and shore installations throughout the Pacific Theater. They had provided close air support for amphibious landings, conducted armed reconnaissance missions over enemy territory, and maintained combat air patrols over friendly installations. The 37mm cannon that had seemed like an engineering mistake had proven to be exactly the weapon needed for a war that nobody had anticipated fighting. The final vindication came in the form of lasting tactical doctrine that recognized specialized aircraft could achieve strategic objectives through focused application of their unique capabilities, even when those capabilities differed dramatically from conventional expectations.